an 8-hour day. Oh, sorry, that just popped up. So, and the Philadelphia general strike involved workers across trades and lines of division. It involves leather dressers, printers, carpenters, bricklayers, masons, house painters, bakers, and then finally city employees, which really scared the legislators. That's actually what built pressure on politicians time and time again. And in respect to the 1835 general strike in Philadelphia, when all those workers started organizing in mass and striking in mass, the legislators were really quick to give in to demands for not only a shorter workday, but also wage increases at that time. And so that's just one example. And another one that I really like historically is the 1903 March of the Mill Children, led by Mother Jones. This was a 3-week strike of child strikers that really galvanized the movement to end child labor in the United States. So, you know, this is our history, and this is still our source of power. And we've seen reflections of that in the contemporary labor movement in the United States as well, with the success of the West Virginia teacher strikers, and in my own home state of Vermont, the 2018 nurses strike at the UVM Medical Center, both of which resulted in increases in wages, and in terms of the nurses strike, staffing reduction that was really important for not only the nurses, but the patients as well. So there's a long history of workers exercising their fundamental power, which is their labor power. And that is usually expressed in its most potent form as withholding that power in the form of a strike. So we're in a very different world today. We look to history just for examples of what has worked in the past, but we know that, you know, things are always different, and capitalism is constantly developing and responding to workers' exercise of power and resistance to capitalism. I had the pleasure of actually speaking to Professor Robert Ovitz just yesterday, who described class struggle as a kind of spiral dance between labor and the capitalists, or workers and management, with workers finding strategic ways to resist and withholding their labor, and management responding with new forms of control. So, you know, right now, we have to really think about strategic ways to exercise that power. We're in the United States, we have high levels of automation and are dependent on a massive global division of labor. And, you know, in a way, it seems like, you know, the power is so concentrated and centralized, but we do, with this, you know, intensely global division of labor, there are key sectors that can be used to disrupt capitalism and gain worker power and reinstitute worker power, such as the logistics sector in particular, because we have a certain stage of capitalist development that depends on the transportation across the globe of goods and services, in terms of also financial services. So there are new choke points that we have to think about as a labor movement, and how to best exploit and coordinate those. But before we even get to that point of, you know, potentially exercising our power in really potent ways, using our strategic position in strategic sectors such as logistics, we need to organize like never before. And right now, I mean, it's really tough in the labor movement. You know, gosh, we're not in a very strong position. I think there's some excitement, but everybody knows that union density in the United States is quite low, at one of its historic lows. 10% in general, 33% in the private sector, 6% in the private sector. And in the state of Vermont, it's pretty much the same. It's, you know, we as a labor council represent 10,000 union members, and there are over 275,000 working Vermonters. So there's vast room to grow, and we're just a tiny segment of the workers in this state. And unions are critical to organizing and coordinating our power and our ability to affect reform and change the world. So right now in the labor movement, the big thing is the ProAct. That is the biggest campaign for the national AFL-CIO, and we've definitely fully supported as well. It would make a huge difference and make it vastly easier to organize. But at the same time, I think it's a mistake to put all our eggs in that basket. We can't count on the ProAct being passed under the Biden administration with a Democratic Party that is not bold enough and willing to do what it must to override the filibuster and really put through legislation. I think, you know, the chances of the ProAct, even if we put a lot of effort in passing, are probably not great. You know, I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but we have to also have to be realistic and assess the situation in a sober way and come to terms with how things are right now. And so we can't wait for the ProAct to organize. There are existential threats facing all workers right now. You know, I don't even have to name them, but you know, the crisis of widening inequality at scales never before seen, or at least since the Gilded Age, systemic racism and climate change. You know, people are dying and barely making it, and we face a really uncertain future. So we need to start organizing workers right now, because workers have such disruptive, potentially revolutionary power. With or without the ProAct, that has to happen. And we shouldn't put all of our efforts into an alienated form of power, which is just constantly petitioning our legislators, our senators and representatives. We need to, you know, also take our energies into going out into the community to organize workers and do a lot of political education. So, and also I'll just say, historically, again, you know, workers have never waited around for perfect legislation to organize and to do what they needed to do to survive, essentially, as some of the historical examples I just cited illustrate. So the unions, you know, when I say unions, it doesn't have to necessarily be organizing into unions, doesn't have to be necessarily established trade unions. Anytime workers come together to advocate in their collective interests is a kind of union. And my point, the union is the workers, not some union staff from the outside, you know, telling the workers to do. So, you know, I support organizing independent unions and also AFL-CIO unions. We need it all. So, you know, and as a labor movement, we need to really prioritize organizing like never before. We need to look to the pressure that the labor movement in the US has been able to build before, when they boldly sought to organize the unorganized. And you know, that happened with the IWW, who was bold enough in the early 1900s to organize workers whom the AFL-CIO and the traditional craft unions wouldn't organize them. And same with the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, in the 1930s. And also underappreciated and barely mentioned, this Communist Party and the Socialist Party played a huge role in organizing the unorganized during moments of crisis in US history, which is what I can speak to. I wish I could speak to Canadian history as well. I would love to sometime. So, you know, in 1934, just to give you an idea of how much mobilization of workers was happening, you know, 1.4 million workers were involved in strike actions. So a mass labor movement was forming, and it was creating a power base for FDR and the New Deal Democrats to pass the kind of bold legislation that set the stage for the most prosperous period in our nation's history, albeit imperfect and incomplete, with the lowest levels of income inequality that we've had since we began measuring it in 1915, lasting until the 1980s. And you know, I always want to remind everyone, and myself even, you know, FDR didn't come in as a radical presidential candidate. he really was being pressured by workers exercising power that threatened capital and threatened the capitalist system. That's what motivated him and got him able to convince the capitalist class for which he served ultimately to agree to all the concessions that were part of the New Deal, and that made it vastly improved the lives of many workers. We can't underestimate that. There's some on the left who deride the New Deal as just putting capitalism on life support. I think that's true, but also workers were in a position where they were not able to even reproduce themselves at some points. They were malnourished, underpaid, overworked, like a real crisis. And that those material reforms in the form of New Deal programs gave them some respite from just brutal oppression. And I think that is very necessary for us to be able to ascend to higher levels of class conflict. And in addition to organized labor on the streets at that time, there was a lot of unemployed and workers mobilizing at that time, which I think is worth remembering as well. The Communist Party had unemployed workers' councils during that time, and there were marches of thousands of unemployed workers. There were hunger marches. There are rent strikes and organizing happening to protect workers from evictions. And I think this is like something we should keep in mind, considering that the CDC, the eviction moratorium put out by the CDC, the deadline is coming up soon on June 30th here in the United States. And there will be a crisis from that. People aren't going to suddenly have all the money they need for back rent. And so, there will be probably a mass of evictions, and we're going to need, labor leaders and leftist leaders to organize to protect those vulnerable groups of workers. And I include the unemployed as workers too. My understanding of workers in the working class is Marxist to its core. Anyone who has to work in order to live, anyone who has to sell their labor power and commodify their labor. So we need to do a lot of organizing to recap, but we also need to reform unions that aren't prioritizing organizing and building workers' power. So this speaks a little bit to my personal experience. I was part of a reform slate back in 2019, just a few years ago, called United. It was a reform slate here in Vermont to transform the Vermont State Labor Council, which had been largely irrelevant and inactive for over a decade. We're talking about poorly attended conventions. I attended conventions prior to 2019 as an executive board member. There were about maybe 20 people coming to these. The most that the Labor Council was doing was repeatedly endorsing Democratic candidates whom didn't really feel like they had to respond to the Vermont State Labor Council because we were small and not really activating a lot of Vermonters. There wasn't that pressure. So we came in with a vision. We ran a slate of 15 candidates, and we put out a 10-point program. And it outlined a vision for a much bolder labor movement. I'm not going to go through all 10 points, but some of the key points was stopping the automatic endorsement of blue no matter who, and moving those funds that were previously given to Democratic candidates or to lobbying into an organizing fund. And from that fund, we pay on-call organizers $15 an hour. We wish we could pay more, but it's $15 an hour to help with door knocking or making calls, whatever we need the on-call organizers to do to support campaigns to build power within existing unions. For instance, fighting austerity currently with faculty at UVM, or to organize new shops. And of course, I can't speak on that too much because those are still very much underway. So we moved, we prioritized organizing, moved our money to organizing what little we had. And we also decided to make a bold statement about being in support of strikes if necessary. And not being afraid to strike. And that was actually really controversial. But this program did win us the election in 2019. So our slate won all the seats on the Executive Council of the Vermont State Labor Council. And we were able to move our program into action over the last few years. And so what that manifested is we endorsed Vermont Progressive Party candidates when we do endorsements. And that has actually played out really well for us. We actually have a viable third party in Vermont, which is quite unique. The Vermont Progressive Party is that party. And we were able to help Progressive gain a strong majority on our Queen City Council, Burlington City Council. And that materialized into power for workers when in the spring of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, Mayor Weinberger, who is a Democrat, a neoliberal Democrat, wanted to do mass layoffs of city workers to fill in the budget gap from the pandemic. And we had our Progressive Party candidates who were strong pro-labor candidates opposing that and standing in solidarity with city workers when we did our car rallies, when we did direct actions. And at the end of the day, within just months, really, we were able to completely defeat Mayor Weinberger's proposed layoffs, which was huge. So that was like an immediate return on, really focusing our support on candidates who really support labor and understand that a worker's power and where that comes from. And we also take inspiration from what I guess would describe as the other labor leaders who understand this as well, such as Sarah Nelson. She's not afraid of strikes. She's a huge inspiration. She's the president of the Association of Flight Attendants Union, which is a CWA AFL-CIO affiliate union. And she threatened a general strike that ended the government shutdown that was hurting airline workers. And so workers are starting to rediscover this fundamental tool and make more and more strike threats and go on strike. And we're starting to see that boldness and courageousness and some material gains from that. And so our council, not being afraid of strikes, it's not just, we need to use this power not just to fight for materially improving conditions, but the rise of fascism in this country. And so unfortunately, in the fall of 2020, we as a country in the United States were in the position of a potential coup. If Trump threatened to not leave office should he lose. And so our council put out a general strike resolution in November of 2020. And we had over 100 attendees at the convention when we voted on this resolution. Again, up from like 20 that would used to come to our conventions every year. And 87% of these delegates voted in favor of it. So that's really big. And ideally in the long term, we would like not to even have a delegate system, but direct member voting on leaders and other initiatives. But that's a longer process that we're trying to reform within the AFL, and it's not easy. So right now, for taking this kind of bold action, there are consequences, and you have to be courageous. Our Labor Council is under investigation by President Trumpka of the National AFL-CIO for passing this resolution. We were warned about this resolution right before we took the vote at our convention, and our members saw that warning, and they knew that it was irrelevant given the historical moment, given the fact that we were about to lose any semblance we have of democracy in this country, that we were facing a constitutional crisis, that we were facing an extreme right-wing fascist movement. They understood the situation, and they understood the seriousness and the need to start thinking about how we can powerfully resist and meaningfully resist. And they voted 87% again in favor of calling for a general strike if there was a coup. And we stand by our members in that vote. And we, call on President Richard Trumka to call off this investigation. He has not so far, but we will continue fighting. And this goes to like another thing that we need to do within the labor movement that leftist activists need to, support and build solidarity around is supporting communist, socialists, and militant leftists in the labor movement and beyond. We're experiencing essentially a long tradition, unfortunately, in the United States of purging socialists and communists and leftists. Before the 1940s, really, in the United States, communists, socialists, leftists were really heroes of the working class. They were getting the goods. They were organizing mass strikes, demonstrations, and unions that were vastly improving the lives of everyday workers. And it was a threat. And so there was a counter movement, right, from the capitalist class to get rid of these leaders. And they were unfortunately quite successful. And unfortunately, some of the labor movement collaborated in suppressing it and removing these leaders. And we need to build that core of socialists, communists, and leftists again, and not be afraid to use those frameworks and to think in terms of the socialist framework. One of my favorite quotes actually is from Eugene Debs, a Socialist Party of America member, and a founder of the American Railway Union, which of course was instrumental in the Pullman strike. And the quote is, "Wherever capitalism appears in pursuit of its mission of exploitation, there will be socialism, fertilized by misery, watered by tears, and vitalized by agitation, unfurling its class struggle banner and proclaiming its mission of emancipation." And you can call this framework whatever you want, socialism, whatever. It's an understanding, a class analysis and understanding that is capable of organizing across industries and lines of division. That's what it essentially is, an understanding that workers create all value and are entitled to their fair share in it, and entitled to control it even. And that's really important, because if we don't have a framework that is able to make those leaps beyond our trade union, beyond our single identity, we will remain divided and weak. And so communist, socialists, and left leaders have long understood that the ruling class maintains its power through this division, and have been some of the most bold leaders in trying to organize across lines of division. One of my other favorites is A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he just made a threat to march 100,000 people into Washington in 1941, and that helped end or start to reform discrimination and fight discrimination, which is a way in which the ruling class divides workers. Okay, my time's up. Okay. So anyway, to conclude, sorry that the heat is beaming down on me today. So socialism, whether or not we use that phrase again, it offers the vision that we need to organize workers, and we need to realize the fundamental source of our power, which is our labor power and our ability to withhold it and coordinate that. We need to organize the unorganized, reform unions as they exist to be more bold, and build a strong socialist, communist left in the United States. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you very much, Liz. I'll let you go on a little longer because our second speaker, Saru Jaraman, is not here. So Rich, take about close to 20 minutes if you like, and then we'll have a discussion after that.
Okay, thanks so much, Liz. It's always great to hear about people inside the labor movement in the United States pushing back and trying to find ways forward. And I think it's pretty important for people in the Canadian state and the Canadian labor movement to hear that, because there's a sad sort of smugness up here quite often that, well, we don't need to learn from the Americans. We're so much better. We've got 30% union density, which of course masks that many of the same things that happened in the United States labor movement have been happening here, just perhaps a slightly slower pace, but the attempts by the ruling class and the right wing to undermine unions continue like to this day. And that's sort of where I wanted to start, is just looking at the inequalities that have increased during COVID, despite constant proclamations by the ruling class, the media, and the wealthy that we're all in this together, that everybody go out and give some applause for our essential workers, blah blah blah, because we clearly recognize that the job you do is essential. However, we're not particularly concerned about your actual life being essential. Seems to be the way the ruling class has put this out there in terms of not giving hazard pay to workers, delaying, at least in many Canadian places, payment to nurses. Right now in Ontario, there's a huge fight by healthcare workers and actually all government workers, because the provincial government has capped wage increases to 1%, despite the fact that they're all in bargaining in the middle of COVID, still did that. So these inequalities that existed are continuing to exist, and they've actually gotten worse, I would argue, at least globally, but in the Canadian state, most definitely. If you think, I was just sort of cursorily looking through some of the sort of quick highlights, and since March last year to March this year, the 47 billion, there's 47 billionaires in Canada. So COVID created 4 new billionaires. That's the big thing for the wealthy. 4 more billionaires were created, but these 47 billionaires, not 47 billion billionaires, but just 47 billionaires, saw their wealth, their actual profit, the money that they have, go up by 78 billion in the first year of COVID, which is a massive sum. And just to put that into context, that's enough on its own. So those 47 billionaires haven't made enough money last year to cover 50% of the bill to provide clean water to everybody in the world, not just First Nations in Canada, who still suffer from trying to get clean water out of the rotten Trudeau government, but for the whole world globally. 50% of the cost is just contained within those 47 people, just in the Canadian state alone. That's enough money that they made last year to give $16,000 to the poorest 3.5 million people in this country. It's those people, the 47, representing like the top 1%, now control the actual amount of wealth that they control in Canada has grown from 28 to 30% over the past 2 years. So they're continually increasing the percentage of wealth that is concentrated in these very few hands. That 87 families, which is about probably 600 people estimate, have the same wealth in Canada as 12 million people. So the bottom 12 million people own the same wealth as the top 600 people. It's absolutely astronomical, this huge inequality that has, began well back with the beginning of the pushback against unions in the 1980s in the United States. I'm sure the statistics are the same in terms of a massive increase, a growing gap in wealth, workers' share of income constantly declining, while a small rapacious group of the 1% continues to amass more and more wealth and more power. Corporations, of course, particularly the banks in Canada, fairly small number of very, very, very wealthy and powerful financial institutions. Royal Bank of Canada put up a $4 billion profit in the first 3 months of this year, primarily on what they call a very healthy mortgage market, which means, and it's not really the place to talk about when we're talking about labor movement, but pet peeve is many on the left are blaming the housing crisis on individuals who sell or buy houses and not actually looking at the massive financial institutions that are driving working class people into despair by speculating on housing markets, offering out mortgages and things like that, and then jacking up the rates, all those sorts of things. So across the board, corporate profits up, small number of people making fantastic amounts of money, while the rest of us still suffer. The health inequalities that have been exposed by COVID have, been absolutely horrific. If you look at, who was dying in terms of nursing homes, it was not the private fancy billionaire nursing homes. It was poor city housing or the for-profit ones that scandalized pensioners by taking all their money. Working class neighborhoods, racialized communities, all of them getting affected at far higher rates of COVID than the wealthy. The lifespans of working people and racialized people in this country continue to show horrific gaps. So the average lifespan is for a man is 79, for a woman is 83. For First Nations, it's 64 and 73, so a 15-year life expectancy and a 10-year life expectancy gap. Where I'm sitting right now in the city of Hamilton, which for people in the United States is like it's a Pittsburgh with steel mills still. It's like I don't know, mini Cleveland, still got steel mills. It's, anyway, it's a fairly, industrialized city. If I walk about 15 minutes to the north of me, the average life expectancy is 65. If I get in my car and drive 10 minutes southwest of here, it goes up to 85. So 2 postal codes within a 20-minute drive in one city, there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And of course, it's based on poverty and income inequality. So all of this strangely occurs in a society that has all the material abilities you could wish for to meet everybody's needs. We technically don't need that 78 billion to provide clean drinking water. Technically don't need that 78 billion to actually increase everybody's living standards up to that postal code in a wealthy neighborhood in Ancaster. We don't actually need that. We technically have the productive capability of meeting everybody's needs to do that. Yet, we have the ability to provide clean water. The Canadian military can establish in the middle of a desert, I believe in Yemen, a military base, and within 3 days be desalinating and providing clean water to troops. But for 30 years, we're not able to do that for First Nations communities in Northern Ontario, Northern BC, and rural communities. So with all this material ability to solve these problems, and yet this society doesn't do that. So it raises the question of how do we flip this? It's not like how do we flip it, but it's like how do we turn the world right side up from the way it is, which is the wrong side up right now, where the majority gain the fruits of their labor as opposed to this tiny minority gaining those fruits. And I think you have to look at the question of class. And I think in a day of rising movements and a low level to some degree of workers' organization, it's very easy for new radicalizing layers and new people fighting back to sort of miss the centrality in the question of class because it doesn't present itself right away to everybody. So for me as a socialist, I think, and a labor movement activist, sometimes we have to step back and actually look at the question of class. And what do we mean by class? It's really not complicated. Lots of people, Marx, great people have written very large books about this stuff, but it's really, what's your relationship to the production of goods and services? Do you own the workplaces that produce those goods and services, or do you have to go into those places to actually work to sell, as Liz said, your labor power? That's the simple analysis of class right there. It doesn't have to take much more. Well, Marx said in capitalist society, there's 2 contending classes, 2 great contending classes, the working class and the ruling class. The bourgeoisie is some of the words he would use. So the ruling class owns the means of production. They have the power in society. Parliament is a structure that they utilize. Our education system is designed on justifying their rule, right? That, pull up yourself by the bootstrap, fair day's pay, fair day's work, all these sort of truisms and common sense things are all actually tools designed to get us to accept the system, right? That now even they can't really hide that much. Used to be able to, I'm sure it's the same in the United States. Every person could pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And there's always this one billionaire that did start out, in a hard life, worked his way up the shop floor or her way up, and then became, a dot-com millionaire. And that's held up. Even now in Canada, the statistics are brutally clear that basically, you're going to die in the class that you were born into, that this notion of upward mobility is a myth, and that there's a small layer of people who can hand down wealth, and the vast majority of us do not have the ability to do that, and we're going to be stuck in the class we're born in. So there's 2 contending classes. That's the society we live in. So we have to talk about, the worker side of that becomes very important. And I think it's important in these days because lots of people, including those at the top, but also inside the academy and theorists of movements, are constantly trying to say class and the working class is an old-fashioned thing to talk about. That's 1930s overall smokestacks, IWW. Nice, doesn't really mean anything today. We have to talk about things in a new way, that the working class doesn't exist really in the way it did. But in 2013, the International Labor Organization, which is a UN sort of NGO group for labor rights and stuff like that, I'm not suggesting that's what it really does, but nonetheless, it produces interesting reports. In 2013, the ILO produced a report that I don't think anybody really picked up on, but it noted the first time in world history where globally, people that would be considered workers or laborers, people have to go into those workplaces to sell, whether it's agricultural or data entry or bus driving or dock working, whatever it is, teaching, was 1.6 billion, which for the first time in history meant that the working class actually was a majority of the world's population. And I think that that's an incredible, and it's grown since quite rapidly. I think quite often in North America, it's easy for people to have a very superficial analysis of class and mistake it that like, oh, lots of people I know who have you know, big flat screen TVs and can, you know, go to, I don't know the food chains in the United States, Arby's or Olive Tree or whatever. And here in Canada, you can go, you know, to these diners and things like that. And that somehow what means you're not a worker anymore. All of a sudden it becomes this notion that's been rammed down our throats about everybody is middle class, that we all want to be middle class. Middle class doesn't describe what you do for a living. And that's what the class that I think I'm talking about and what's important. And when we talk about workers, I think it's important also that we're talking about those who create the wealth under capitalism, right? That we're often told that, oh, you know, Bill Gates, so smart, did this. He doesn't create wealth. He exploits others who create wealth, and he takes that surplus for himself, either reinvest. I'm not going to go through the whole market economics in there, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about those who go and create the wealth. When we talk about the working class, we're talking about the info miners who, for our American brothers and sisters and comrades. It's a mining company actually owned by a Brazilian company, Vale. That's now out on strike. It's about 3,000 miners out on strike with a long history of a very rebellious steelworkers local who, in the 70s, you know, basically had armed picket lines and things like that. It was a very, very militant, very historic sort of piece of the Canadian working class. They were out on strike. So we're talking about them. We're also talking about the wine rack employees, which is a wine store. So these are the cashiers and shelf stockers, very much the precariat. They're out on strike. We're talking about both of these. We're talking about dock workers who in Montreal were out on strike. We're talking about teachers who in the United States have led a wonderful wave of strikes. I think it's rekindled a question of class and organization. I know it's inspired teachers up here. All over the place, teachers have Red for Ed t-shirts here. And actually their union leadership called some of their like sort of days of action Red for Ed. So this really sort of spun off. We've got that, talking about bus drivers, talking about data entry. We're talking, Chantal just noted, there's Quebec, there's public sector strikes. So this is what we mean when we talk about workers. It's not this ancient notion of, there's an understanding that the economy's changed, jobs change. It means the actual work workers do changes in those societies, right? And Karl Marx once said that everything under capitalism eventually gets proletarianized. And I always think about my dad, who at one point in his life was a bank clerk in Britain, which was seen as like sort of a ticket out of the working class. And then I remember about 15 years ago reading about bank workers forming unions and striking because the job was no longer like this semi-profession. It had become proletarianized. The work had become routinized, it had been de-skilled, and this is going on and on and on. So this is what we mean when we talk about the working class. We talk, it's class that covers all men, women, LGBTQ, Black, white, First Nations. That's the working class. It isn't this attempt to stereotype, you know, Joe Hard Hat or whatever as the work. The class is who goes to work and sells their labor. It's straightforward. So we have to know that. We have to make sure that everybody else, like when we're talking about class, that we make that clear. Because I think, you know, in the classroom, whether it's university or high school, if they even talk about class, unions get presented as sort of stodgy old white guy things, which unfortunately much of the leadership is still that stereotype, but we can talk later about how we change that. So it's often fashionable, I think, on both left and right today, when we talk about workers, to talk about a modern economy and how people are too precarious to really fight back or to form unions. And I find often the left discourse and the right-wing discourse feed into each other on this by attempting to totally undermine the power that workers actually have, despite what is called, you know, precarious. If you look at one of the highest levels of density in Toronto for workers is in the construction trade, which is an insanely precarious work. Like if you do a successful job, it literally means you're now getting laid off because your job is done. You don't know when you're going from one to one. Yet through the 80s and 90s, there were huge battles, often led by left-wingers, including people in the Communist Party and left Social Democrats, to transform that industry by doing what they called wobbling it, putting out strikes to maintain and capture more and more pieces of work for the union, which means Toronto now has one of the highest union densities for construction workers, and their wages and whatnot reflect that as well. So it's not that people who are precarious don't have power. It's a question of realizing that power. And we've seen workers at wine racks. Sarah was going to talk about the struggles in restaurants. look at cleaners, where that struggle is a sector that I help organize in Toronto, whether we've been fully successful or not, but a cleaner in Toronto starting in January will actually begin to get a pension. So far from being prepared, they've been able to fight back, organize, build density in their industry, and push back against employers, and begin to flip a script that began in the 1970s of contracting out work, and begin to actually make it costly to contract out that work, because now people are trying to say, we've got our benefits, we've got our wages going up, now we need a third leg of our stool, which is you're going to have to pay for me to retire. So there's those sorts of things. We look at the potential that Amazon workers represent, right? Far from being precarious, they actually have a lot of power. And I will note that in Ontario, one of the things that forced our right-wing government dug forward into actually accelerating the distribution of the vaccine into poor and working class neighborhoods was the threat in an area called Brampton. And for those of you who don't follow, I already got to end, Peter. Uh-oh, I'm in trouble. Anyway.
A minute or two, comrade.
Okay, I'll be very brief. Then one of the things that forced the acceleration of the rollout into working class neighborhoods and into poorer neighborhoods was the threat of the public health. It unfortunately didn't come from the workers themselves, but of the public health department in Brampton saying that they were going to shut down warehouses where there were outbreaks. That would have meant Amazon, Canadian Tire, like every massive warehouse operation in Canada has a huge warehouse in Brampton. It would have shut it down completely and gummed up the economy. That's what moved it. It was the threat of those workplaces, which to me is a weird way to see the power that workers potentially have to gum up the whole system. I will note that for those of us in Canada, there's a lot going on. We've seen the dock workers get legislated back to work, so we see what governments will do to try to stop people at those very, very sort of logistical pinpoints that Liz was talking about. They will do everything in their power to rule inside their favors. They broke the strike, and unfortunately, the labor movement is not yet moving enough, primarily because those at the top are still stunned by COVID, unable to realize the power, more worried about maintaining the union as an institution than rather a tool for workers' power. And that's something that we're going to have to actually work and discuss. And Peter's given me the wrap-up signal, but I would say this: there's a lot on the table, I think, coming out of COVID. There's a pent-up anger and a pent-up frustration of workers all across the board. And there's also a real rapacious desire of the employers to begin to take out on workers what they feel they can. And we're seeing it at the wine rack, we're seeing it at INCO, we're seeing it at the Vaughan strike, the nurses strike out in Sarnia. There's a whole series of strikes right now. A lot of them are against tiering of contracts, trying to use this moment to squeeze workers and create divisions by tiering contracts and whatnot. But we also, so there's a lot potentially coming up here where I think a lot of workers are going to be looking to fight back inside the labor movement here, and I'm sure it exists inside the United States. The leadership are like lambs leading lions, terrified to death of anything broader than a postcard campaign or a one-day demonstration, which maybe is better than what you get in the United States. But that's what, and so it's going to take a much, not just technical solutions on how do we organize, it's going to take political solutions of workers on the shop floor, organizing, discussing, debating, and figuring out ways to go forward. And for socialists to be organized, to be intervening in those strikes, to find ways to link things up. How do we link up the strikers at Rexplatz with the workers at the wine rack? How do we show that this is working class unity? Can we do solidarity meetings for the strikers at INCO to begin to bring that message? Because I think there are workers looking to hear this message, and our leadership is not going to do this on their own. They are going to have to be pushed kicking and screaming into resisting what's going on with COVID. And I know we can see that for those in the labor movement in Canada right now, the heads of the Canadian Labour Congress and the heads of the big unions are doing the exact opposite, Liz, of what you're talking about trying to do in Vermont. They're trying to limit and give more control to the tiny top of the labor movement over who goes to conventions and who doesn't, over who gets to speak on the labor movement and who doesn't. And it's a big fight because at least in Ontario, and I know other places, a lot of good activity and solidarity rolls out of the labor councils, which are open to delegates. It's a bit different than in the US. So they can become a hub of activism and resistance. And they want to start to change that so that it's the big presidents controlling the labor councils rather than actually from the ground up. So there are lots of fights. And I think if you're in Canada or in the United States and you want to be part of helping organize debate. We need debate, we need theory, and we need practice. And that's why we need an organization. We need socialist organization to knit the militants together, to assess what works, what doesn't work, to debate strategy, and to put ways forward that can link workers who I think are looking for ways to fight right now together and actually try to build a stronger movement that begins to make gains. Because we know that every time there's a strike, there's a glimmer of a new society. And we always see it when we see big mass strikes. And I'll just say what in 1972 in Quebec, when there was a general strike, workers began to run society themselves, took over the radio stations, delivered their own milk, began to decide the priorities. You can see the glimmers of that world I was talking about. It's upside down right now, of being that new world being flipped right side up, where the vast majority of society, the working class, is beginning to determine the priorities of how we make it, who we make it, and who should benefit from it. And that's going to be the vast majority of us. So I'm sorry, Peter, I just abused your share.